This segment is on incidental motions as described within Robert's Rules of Order, and it's a part of parliamentary law. And the subtitle of this is More Ways to Prevent Yourself from Getting Run Over in Meetings. So we'll start out with a motions overview just to put the incidental motions in context with the other motions that we've talked about. So going to the slide called Classes of Motions. So we've talked previously about main motions, which is how business is brought before a group. We've talked about subsidiary motions. We've talked about privileged motions, which are high priority motions that you make when that sort of interrupt other things. This class of motions are called incidental motions, and there's a reason why it's called that. They're also end up getting a high priority because of the urgent nature that they address. And then the final group is motions that bring up questions again before the assembly, but that's really a subclass. So so motions, the thing to remember about them is that there are characteristics of each one. And you know, if you're a real pro, you've got the reference sheet in front of you, so you don't have to rely upon your memory for this stuff. The things to remember about each of these motions are: is it in order when another has the floor, or can you interrupt? Is a second required, or can you on your own cause this action to occur? Is the motion debatable, or is it undebatable? That's kind of a big thing. Is the motion amendable? So can you move something that someone else then can modify, or does what you move get voted on? And then what vote is required for adoption? So it's generally either majority or 2/3. And then can the motion be reconsidered is also something that you need to know. If it's something that you don't want to hear again and someone's trying to reconsider it and it can't be reconsidered, then you can block it. So this class is called Incidental Motions.
And just before we continue, Larry, hi everybody. I'm John, and I'll be in the YouTube chat, and we'll be taking questions whenever Larry stops in a moment. Hi, Barbara. Good to see you here. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Let's go to the next slide, and we'll go over the definition of an incidental motion. So incidental motions relate to pending business. As a class, incidental motions deal with questions of procedure arising out of another pending motion or another item of business. And so this kind of gives you a glimmer into the power of this stuff. When I was assembling this presentation, it really struck me how static meetings tend to be, because people are unaware of these tools that they could use in the meetings. And if you have a group of people that are really up on their rights inside of meetings, and you have leadership that's trying to curtail those rights, it should be a very lively meeting. What we usually see is when people use one of these motions is a bunch of eye rolling because they think that you're just trying to delay whatever it is that they need to get to after the meeting. But really, these are about ensuring your democratic role is protected within the meeting. So let's go to the next slide, characteristics of the incidental motions. These relate to the main question in such a way that they must be decided immediately before business can proceed, and most incidental motions are undebatable. So there's a good thing to remember right off the bat, that they're undebatable. The next two slides go over the series that we will be talking about today. There's a lot of them, and the intention is not that you learn everything that is said today, but really to familiarize with the tools in your toolkit so that when you need one of these motions, you can either quickly look it up on a reference card, or at the very worst case, encounter a situation where you needed it in the meeting, couldn't remember how to use it, and then you had to look it up later. But that's actually a good way to remember it. So the incidental motions we'll be talking about are point of order. If you watched our famous excerpt from the Senate hearings from Peter Strzok, with them yelling point of order back and forth at each other, that's what this one is.
There's a lot of that.
There was.
And it was Peter Strzok. None of us got his name
Peter
right
Strzok.
afterwards. But yeah, that one guy sitting like to the left of the chair, just point, just always, right? He made a lot of points of order. But it was important. It was important, you know.
Not a role model chair either. He was not. I mean, you know, people become chairs and they don't know how to do this stuff.
Yes, that could be seen.
The next one is appeal, and these two will be talked about together. And there's a reason why these are two of my favorite, which we'll get to. And I put them into the front of the deck so that everyone would get to see it instead of saving the best for last. There's suspend the rules, which is a little bit complicated, but it allows you to do things that you maybe thought you weren't able to do. There's object to the consideration of a question, division of a question, and consideration by paragraph. Those are two motions that are very, very similar. But, you know, if you have something that you need to consider in more detail, this is a way to go about it instead of just, you know, being forced to deal with one big, long set of paragraphs.
That would seem to be like crucial in dealing with like big legislation, right? Like, yo, let's take this part by part.
Yes.
Very cool.
Then there's motions that have to do with voting. So division of the assembly. This is one of those that where you can protect your rights. We had a situation in a meeting a couple of weeks ago where there were 17 credentialed people, and later when we reviewed the notes of the meeting, we realized that in one of the votes, 18 people voted. And because it was an electronic meeting, we don't know who actually voted, how. So we were completely trusting the leadership. This is what we should have done. We should have actually called for a roll call vote so we could have verified that the people were voting as basically as we expected it to, because there was a couple of votes that we expected to win and we did not, and we are not quite sure why. There's motions related to methods of voting, and then there's requests and inquiries, because you don't have to sit there knowing all of this stuff to be effective. You actually have ways in which you can do inquiries of the chair to get information about how these things should be handled. And the chair should really be explaining anything out of the ordinary for you anyway on their own. But if you don't, you're more than welcome to find out. The next two slides are charts, and they really sort of go over the characteristics of all of them. The most telling one of this one is the debatable column. Appeal is debatable, and that is under a very specific set of circumstances, but the rest are not debatable, which means that, you know, I move to consider by paragraph. They can't start debating whether or not you want to do that. They should go to a vote, and if a majority wants to do that, then that's what you get to do. Amendable, there's logic behind these being amendable, and so as you study the material, you can probably trick out the underlying logic so you don't have to memorize this stuff. And then on the votes required, generally it's a majority vote for things unless it's something that has to do with curtailing people's parliamentary rights, and then that's a 2/3 vote. And then there's a couple of things where it doesn't even make sense to vote. They're just done. And seconded, again, that's a good one to have on your reference sheet. Next page is the balance of them. Again, most of them are not debatable. The ones on voting are debatable, and we'll talk about why that is. Suspend the rules, and then when you're doing rules of order, then that requires 2/3, but everything else, like suspending standing rules, is a majority. So let's go to the first two motions. So these are point of order and appeal. And the reason why I love them is that these two were really brought home for me the concept of democracy and the will of the people. And it really illustrates how the chair is just a facilitator of the meeting. The chair is not the lord of the meeting or the mistress of the meeting who's imposing their will on the assembly. It's actually the other way around. Unless the majority of the people agree to operate that way. And these two motions work in tandem. So you really need to have a point of order before you can move to the appeal. And you'll see why in just a moment. So going to the first one, point of order. This is the one you hear most frequently, and certainly on that hearing. This is when a member thinks that the rules of the assembly are being violated. You can make a point of order, thereby calling upon the chair for a ruling and an enforcement of the regular rules. So if someone has made a motion and it's undebatable, and someone else starts debating and the chair is letting them debate, you can say, point of order, this motion is undebatable, and the chair will stop the debate. Or they'll look at the parliamentarian who will say, you have to stop the debate, and they'll stop the debate. Going to the next slide, the characteristics of a point of order. It takes precedence over any pending question out of which it may arise. So it's numero uno. It can be applied to any breach of the assembly's rules. It's an order when another has the floor, even interrupting a person speaking if the point generally requires attention at such a time. So this is one of those rare motions where you don't need to be recognized by the chair. You have seen some flagrant violation of the rules, and you can just stand up and say point of order and interrupt someone who's speaking if that's required. You never, the golden rule is never be a jerk, but you do need to stand up for yourself.
It just seems that based on the very limited history I've seen of parliamentary procedure, most often you're calling this on the chair. But I could be wrong.
Next slide. There's a few more characteristics about this. So does not require a second. So someone else doesn't have to say, oh yeah, this is not debatable. No, it's not debatable. Does not require a second. It's not amendable. Because amending it doesn't really make any sense. And it's normally ruled upon by the chair. So no vote is taken unless the chair is in doubt or their ruling is appealed. So the first part of that one is interesting because if the chair doesn't have to pretend like they know everything. And certainly if it's something where there's some ambiguity, the chair is always welcome to take a vote of the assembly and let the majority decide on something. If you remember the discussion we had about whether or not the Rules Committee should have jurisdiction over the delegate selection convention, if this is something that the chair is unclear of, like they can't read the bylaws, they can allow the assembly to decide on it.
And it's if again, based on experience, the chair is supposed to be humble about this, but in general, they're probably not going to admit that they don't know the rules, and then it's up to us to remind them, right? I mean, is that where the appeal comes in?
And I made so many mistakes that I have built-in humility. So
right. Well, good for you. But anyway.
So next slide, just a few more details on this one. It is the right of every member who notices a breach of the rules to insist on their enforcement. So this goes back to credentialing and why it's important to be credentialed in a meeting if you are entitled to that. It is your right to do this. Don't look to someone else in the meeting to do this. Take it upon yourself because there's probably other people thinking the same thing as you are, and they're hesitant. The great debate 2 years ago over a bylaws change that ended up being very impactful. The one person who asked about it was a newly arrived Berniecrat who just had this feeling that there is something out of order being asked, and she didn't know the proper way to object to it. And so she kind of made a question, and she was kind of shut down, and she allowed herself to be shut down by the person running the meeting. And the assembly ended up passing something that was far more impactful than they had been told, and it took us a year to unwind that mess. So you can always do a point of inquiry, which we'll talk about later, if you are hesitant about something. And that's a nice way of approaching something, just so to get clarification before you pull out the grenades. And as the second point says, if a member is uncertain as to whether there is a breach, they can make a parliamentary inquiry of the chair, who then is going to turn to the parliamentarian and get the stuff from them, probably. Next slide, point of order, the timeliness. A point of order must be made at the time of the breach unless it's of a continuing nature. In all such cases, it is never too late to raise a point of order since any action so taken is null and void. So get that piece. Any action taken is null and void if you bring it up. And the final slide on this one, so an example of how to do it, it's really simple. So a member rises and without waiting for recognition, addresses the chair and says, I rise to a point of order, or more simply, people just say, point of order. And the chair asks the member to state their point. And then the member says, I make the point of order that, the previous motion made is undebatable. The debate needs to stop, or whatever the issue is that they are objecting to.
I just want a point of order that this is not to be used to just state your feelings. That's not what, and it seems like a lot of people think that that's what you're doing to me,
Correct.
Yeah. I'm point of order. I need to inject my opinion here, and that's not what this is for, right, Larry?
And that's when the chair says, no, you don't get to debate. What is your point of order? That's why the chair says, state your point.
Very cool.
Yeah. Any questions on that one, or shall we go to the second half of this duo power coupling of motions?
No, there's no questions. There's just a few people here. Thank you guys for joining us. Oz is here, and Jeffrey and Barbara. But that seems so important. This basic. How many people in the party don't even know these basic rules that you can do this? It's just I didn't. So
the next one, I have never seen used. I saw someone try to use it, and the chair walked over to them, being about 2 feet taller than the person trying to do the appeal, and said, "You want to appeal a ruling of the chair?" And the poor person said, "No," and then walked away.
Oh, well, that's the chair totally being a facilitator. Yeah.
Yeah. He's gone.
Good. All right, so number 2.
Appeal. So any two members have the right to appeal decisions of the chair. This motion takes the question from the chair and vests it with the assembly for the final decision. Hence why I think it's so cool that this demonstrates the power of the majority. And the last one is very telling. So members have no right to criticize a ruling of the chair unless they appeal from the chair's decision. So if you sit there and don't bring this up, then you have no right to bitch about it later.
Wow, that's kind of democracy in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's not, it's not a spectator sport. So the characteristics of an appeal: it takes precedence over any other question pending at the time the chair makes a ruling from which the appeal can be made. So some of the things that we've been dealing with, you gotta do the point of order to have the chair make a ruling in which then you can appeal. And then that's how you take the decision out of the chair's hand and move it into the assembly. And it has to be done in a meeting, otherwise you have no other platform in which to use these tools. You can't do this, through IM and chat and on a phone call. It's got to be in a meeting where you have the assembly participating and can back you up.
You can't do this on Facebook?
Sorry. It can be applied for any ruling of the chair, and it is in order when another has the floor, but must be made at the time of the ruling, and it does require a second. So next one, any two members have the right to appeal decisions of the chair. The motion takes the question from the chair and vests it in the assembly for the final decision. Oh, this is a duplicate. Let's go to the next one. So the mechanics of an appeal is that a chair makes a ruling. It's out of order to consider having a booth at the fair for 2018 because it's too late. And then that's when a member jumps up and says, I appeal the decision of the chair. And then the chair says, the chair's decision's been appealed. I'm not offended because, this is your meeting. And then they say, so this is the reason why I think it's too late. The the deadline is in 2 days, and we've not done any organization. We have no one to lead it. It takes a lot of work, and that's why we really can't do a booth at the fair this year. After that, every member has one opportunity to speak either for or against the ruling of the chair. So the people in the assembly can listen to both sides of the argument, and then once that's been, everyone has said their piece, the chair has one final opportunity to maybe respond to something that's been said, but then the chair takes a vote. And then a majority, and the question should be so that a yes vote sustains the decision of the chair, which means that the ruling of the chair stands. A no majority would overturn the ruling of the chair, and that's how the people take back the power. Pretty cool, huh?
Yes, actually.
Very dramatic.
When you know what you're doing, yes. And I just want to say, Barbara says there should be a Robert's Rules Olympics. And is there some kind of competition for people? I know you've got the Cascadia thing going on.
There are. The ones that I know about are more at the high school level. And they used to be more active. I was going to be a judge at one earlier this summer, but it was canceled because of the lack of participation. So we're going to see what we can do to bolster this, because the other thing that we hear from people who watch these shows is, why didn't I learn this in high school? Why wasn't I taught this before? And so what we want to do is get kids excited about this stuff when they're young, so they can just be terrors when they join organizations when they hit 18.
That's awesome. Do you tell them the reason that the government didn't want them learning this stuff and to take their power? That's why.
Yes, we will.
Oh, good. There you go, Barbara. So yeah, there are groups, and Larry, just plug your own group, because anybody can join that, and you guys do parliamentary procedure during the discussion, right? Yes,
we have now established a virtual group for people who don't live in areas that have groups that meet physically together. So we follow electronic meeting rules so that everyone's rights are protected. And the meetings themselves are run according to parliamentary procedure, so you get used to using those tools in the proper way and seeing them used in action. And for the meetings, then we also have a program that focuses on specific topics. The next one is going to be on September 9th or 13th. But if you go to advancementofdemocracy.org, and we'll talk about that at the end, it'll show you where to sign up, and you'll receive notices.
All right. Yeah, I forgot. You got a lot of slides. Let's go.
So the way it works is the member, without waiting to be recognized, stands up, looks at the chair, and says, I appeal from the decision of the chair. And it should be on what the chair just ruled on, so it should be clear what it's about. Any questions on that one?
Nope.
As I said, high drama. I'm anxious to see this one being put to the test someday.
Yeah, that would it'd be nice. And we saw that example of the action going on at the national level. It'd be cool to have that kind of going on at the state level. And Jeffrey, my volume's lower because I have to manually adjust it all the time. Sorry, guys. Carry on.
The next one is a parliamentary inquiry. So a question directed to the presiding officer to obtain information on a matter of parliamentary law or the rules of the organization bearing on the business at hand. The chair is not obliged to answer hypothetical questions. So yeah, don't screw around with the chair. But if there is something that you want to know, like in the last meeting we were at, there was a question on whether we could suspend the bylaws to consider a resolution, and it turns out that if you make provisions for the suspension of bylaws in the bylaws, yes, you can. But that's way down in the weeds for most people. And so if that's not clear to you, and you kind of knew that you cannot suspend bylaws, you can say, I'm sorry, I have a parliamentary inquiry, and get the question answered. The next slide is an example, and all you say is, Madam President, I rise to a parliamentary inquiry, or just say parliamentary inquiry, and then state what you have a question about, and and the chair will respond to you. And if you remember from previous meetings, all discussion goes through the chair. It doesn't go between members. It doesn't go between members and the parliamentarian. All the traffic is directed through the chair. Next slide, number 4, is very similar. It's a request for information. This is if it's not related to parliamentary procedure, but if it's about something else that's going on, like if someone's made a motion to have a fare booth and and it wasn't explained completely to you, you can raise for a request for information and say things like, could you please explain what hours the booth needs to operate, or what the requirements are, what are the minimum requirements for the booth, and then the chair will have who's ever knowledgeable about the subject matter respond to you. And next slide is an example, and it's very simple. It just, Mr. President, I have a request for information, and the chair will say, the member will state his question, and then you state whatever you need to know. The next one is when you have been given something that is very lengthy and needs to be broken up. So a long motion consisting of a series of resolutions, paragraphs, articles, or sections that are not totally separate questions can be considered by opening the different parts to debate and amendment separately without a division of the question. So the key differentiation here between this one and the next one is that them not totally separate questions. So if there are a bunch of things that are going to be separated, that's a slightly different way of being handled.
So this is, oh no, you've got an example. Never mind. We'll look. Do you have an example?
So consideration by paragraph, it can be applied to main motions that are appropriate. So if someone has introduced a resolution, perhaps with 15 whereases, that's appropriate for that to be considered. It's out of order when another has the floor, so this isn't something that is a truly high priority, and you have to wait till you're recognized by the chair to speak. It must be seconded, so someone else has to want to also do what you want to do. But it is not debatable, but it is amendable, and it just requires a majority vote.
So this would be like if me and Justin Bryce were looking at something together in a meeting, and I'm like, I have no idea what they're saying in paragraph 2 to you, and he's like, no, me either. I'm going to consider that by paragraph, and Justin says, I'll second it.
Yes.
In other words, it would make more sense for you to find somebody else who agrees with you that you need to do that before doing it, right?
Yeah. And it really is to break it down. And so, you have a long set of things that really have to move forward together. Paragraph 1, everyone's cool with. Paragraph 2, maybe there's some things you amend about it. The next paragraph, you focus on, and it's a way of breaking it down into sections as opposed to, just throwing the whole thing out and having to consider it at one time.
Cool.
And then you have to vote on the overall motion once it has been worked through. To trigger this one, it's very simple. All you need to say is, Mr. President, I move that the resolution be considered by paragraph. The next one is the cousin of what we just discussed. It's when a motion relating to a single subject contains several parts, each of which is capable of standing as a complete proposition. If the others are removed, the parts can be separated to be considered and voted on as if they were distinct questions. So if someone has brought in a motion and it's got a bunch of stuff in it, and they're really independent things, you can say division of the question, and then you can vote on the different parts, and you can vote some of the parts up and you can vote other parts down, and you don't do the overall passage of the question at the end because you've passed the individual parts. Hope that makes sense. It's out of order when another has the floor, must be seconded, it's not debatable, it is amendable, And if you want to know what that means, I would recommend studying up on it. And it only requires a majority vote. And an example of this one is, Madam President, I move to divide the resolution into two parts, or whatever the two parts are. And if a majority of the assembly agree with you, then that's what you're going to do. The chair can't say, no, we really have to, we have to consider this all at once together, and that's what I rule. And that's where you go back and you say, I appeal a ruling of the chair. Number 7, objection to the consideration. This was an interesting one. So the purpose of this motion is to enable the assembly to avoid a particular original main motion altogether when it believes it would be strongly undesirable for the motion to even come before the assembly. So if someone has brought some jerk has brought in some motion that's really embarrassing, and you don't even want to debate it because the press are there and they're going to write about it, you can object to the consideration of the question and remove it from the discussion without having to discuss it. Like at the Constitutional Convention, someone should have objected to the consideration of slavery.
Except they would have all lost their slaves,
or at least half of them. Characteristics of objection of consideration. So it can be raised only before there's been any debate or a subsidiary motion. So there's a tiny window in which you have to act on this one. It's an order when another has the floor, does not require a second, and is not debatable, and it's not amendable. It requires a 2/3 vote. So you don't get to explain why you don't want to consider that one. It should be so obvious to everyone that you don't have to debate it.
Could you use this with the constitutional second rights thing on the ballot? That seems pretty ridiculous in itself.
If it was brought up in a meeting,
as to support it or not.
Like if you went to the Tea Party meeting where they moved to act on it, you could use this.
Oh, all right, great.
Or the Republican Party, or whoever the group behind it is. And that would be a great one. It's like, I object to the consideration of this ballot measure, and then if a majority agree with you, then it would be dropped.
Well, that would be fun to try. Next.
An example of this one is, Mr. President, I object to the consideration of the question, and then they should immediately go to a vote. The next one, suspend the rules of order. This one gets a little tricky, and you have to understand the concepts of bylaws and rules of order and special rules of order, because they're all distinct categories of rules, in order to really understand what this one means. But at a high level, when an assembly wishes to do something during a meeting that it cannot do without violating one or more of its regular rules, it can adopt a motion to suspend the rules, interfering with the proposed actions, provided that the proposal is not in conflict with the bylaws or state law. So an example of this would be the standing rules around the election of delegates to the Democratic National Committee. We have a long set of elaborate rules that we've used for years. No one ever questions those, but it is possible for someone to object to them and say, I move that we suspend the rules because, and then explain why they want to do it. And you can do that. So the characteristics of this one, this can be made at any time that there's no question pending. So there's got to be some open space for you to do it. Or when business is pending, suspend the rules takes precedence over any motion if it is for the purpose connected with the motion. So if someone has moved something and it is not allowed under the rules, then that is when it's appropriate to say, I suspend the rules. The characteristics of suspend the rules, so it must be seconded, it is not debatable, and it's not amendable, and it usually requires a 2/3 vote.
There are no questions, but I will tell you that Jeffrey Pearson says we may need a bigger gavel for the troublemakers.
Or a fly swatter.
Whatever works, man.
Object and effect of the motion. So suspends one or more rules, such as the rules contained in the parliamentary authority, the special rules of order, or the standing rules. And a note on this one, on the next slide, the particular rule to be suspended is not mentioned. So you don't have to quote the rule that you're mentioning, but a motion must state its specific purpose, and its adoption permits nothing else to be done under its suspension. What that means is just because you're suspending the rules for this one case doesn't mean that all the rules have been thrown out of the window and you can do whatever the heck you want for the rest of the meeting. This is suspending the rules for this one particular item.
And it means it's done after the meeting, right? Next week, we don't carry on with the suspended rules for that thing, right?
Right. It's only within this one session, and it's only for the current. And at the State Central Committee, we had 3 resolutions that were considered under new business. And one of the things that we had to do to consider those was suspend the rules because the provision to suspend the rules are built into the bylaws, but it took a separate vote on all 3 of those. So everyone had to agree to suspend the rules to discuss each of those 3 resolutions and then vote on them.
Complicated.
There are rules that cannot be suspended. So bylaws in general cannot be suspended unless there's a particular rule for its own suspension, which is what allowed the bylaws to be suspended at the State Central Committee meeting. No applicable procedural rule prescribed by federal, state, or local law can be suspended because those take precedence over the rules of the organization. And rules that embody fundamental principles of parliamentary law cannot be suspended.
Is that supposed to say cannot?
Yes, I think it should say cannot. The rules are a little elusive. It's hard to find a list of them. You can find lists of them, but it's not like a definitive list because parliamentary law is more of a common understanding. But these are things like we've talked about before of every member having the right to vote and speak and participate in meetings. So those are fundamental rights, and you cannot suspend those for an individual.
Check out that real-time graphics update.
Next slide has examples that cannot be suspended. So rules that protect the basic right of individual members cannot be suspended. Rules that have application outside of the session which is in progress also cannot be suspended. This is one that I've been thinking about a lot because we have committee meetings outside of the main meeting, and it would be great to have the ability to make things a little bit more expeditious inside the meeting, but it's clear that we can't suspend rules inside of a committee meeting that are generated by the parent organization.
That's interesting to know. And
Yes.
just Barbara says these Robert's rules do put a damper on chaos at meetings. Yeah, if you know them, right?
Yes, that's why they're called rules of order.
Those pesky rules.
And that's why General Robert wrote them, is that he ran a meeting that was absolute chaos. And he said, I need rules of order. And so he sat down and wrote them. The form of this one is, I move to suspend the rules and adopt the following resolution. Or I move to suspend the rules which interfere with, and then talk about whatever it is that you want to suspend. Next one is on voting. So the object of these motions is to obtain a vote on a question in some form other than by voice, show of hands, or by rising. These include those that the vote be taken by ballot or by roll call, and that a standing vote be counted. And the characteristics of this are, it's out of order when another has a floor, so you have to rise and be recognized by the chair in order to move it. It must be seconded, so someone else in the meeting has to agree with you. It, however, is not debatable, but it is amendable. So you can say, I I move to count by a rising vote, and someone can amend it and say, I'm move to amend that to be counted by ballot. And then you can debate that and do whatever you want. It requires a majority vote except to close the polls, which requires a 2/3 vote. And closing the polls means like the period in which has been allowed for voting. So if you're in a meeting and people are voting and it's straggling on and you need closure, you can move to close the polls, which requires a 2/3 vote. Again, this is when, so the thing behind this is ordinarily only the chair gets to decide if votes need to be counted. If in the case that I was talking about earlier, where we're all on the phone, we didn't get to see who voted and how people voted, this is when we can say, I move to a roll call vote. And then all of the registered members of the meeting would be called out, and then they would say yay or no, and then you would tally up the votes based on that. Or you could say, I move that we do ballot voting, if you have a way to do that. And that would give you physical evidence of how people voted that would exist after the meeting. But those are the kinds of things that unless they're written into the bylaws, don't get to occur unless the chair wants to do them or a majority of the assembly decides to do so. Number 10, division of the assembly. So when a member doubts the result of a voice vote or a vote by show of hands, they can call for a division of the assembly, thereby requiring the vote to be taken again by rising. So this is also related to the voting questions. If you remember the famous video of the Denver Delegate Convention, there was a voice vote called for by Roberta, and it was not clear whether the yeses or the nos had it. And so someone could have called for a division, and they could have required that an actual vote be taken, even though there were 900 people in the room. Tough, but that's how democracy works.
Well, if you listen to the tapes, well, first of all, it was Nevada. You said Denver, but if you listen to the tapes, people were calling for that. You couldn't hear them. There were
then shame on her.
Yeah, that was part of it. There were people calling for that. There were parliamentarians in there that knew what to say, and then they started chanting it. But by the time they started chanting it, she was gone. She was off stage. So.
And that's when they should have marched the vice chair of the convention to the podium to continue with the meeting.
Yeah, there you go.
But that's a whole different thing.
Well, yeah, because that's when the police lined the front of the stage, and it looked like a Nazi meeting. So, anyway, Robert's rules, everybody.
So the characteristics of division of the assembly, it can be applied to any motion on which the assembly is called upon to vote by voice or show of hands. It is in order when another has the floor, does not require a second, and is not debatable. So this is one of those that you can call upon yourself. So if you didn't think the chair made the correct call on a voice vote, you can call for a division.
That's cool. I want to just drop this question here because it's a good one, and I know you can address this. Bill Gabriel, I'd imagine that often the chair may not have the perfect grasp of these rules, resulting in meetings.
Oh, sorry.
Often. Saying, they don't know the rules, so what then? And this is where the parliamentarian, there's a person there that's supposed to do that for them, right?
Yes. It gets awkward when you have a parliamentarian who doesn't know what they're talking about, and we come across those periodically. I mean, you really have to understand the concepts of democracy and majority rule, and if you don't believe in those, you have no business being in the role of a parliamentarian, because this knowledge is carried around by so few people that you often find people resorting to individuals who own a copy of Robert's Rules and who have professed enough knowledge to be a parliamentarian. But, unless they have accreditation from the National Association of Parliamentarians or some similar organization, I wouldn't believe them, because it is very difficult to attain either registered or professional status. So it's hard to imagine that someone who doesn't understand the concepts of democracy to get through those hoops. But it is a problem when you have people appointed to this role who don't understand the rules and are advising the chair. But again, the parliamentarian is only advising the chair, and in the very beginning of the book, it says one of the characteristics that you need for a chair is someone who understands the rules of how to run a democratic meeting if they're running a democratic meeting. These are not meetings run like nonprofits where you have an executive board and a president who makes a bunch of decisions and people carry them out. This is not how a democracy is run.
And Bill, everybody, if you haven't seen it, just I'll try to find the link before we're done. But you go find that that little clip of the Peter Strzok Judiciary Committee meeting, because the parliamentarians were the real people doing the battle in that. They were the ones keeping democracy in line, and that's where I learned, holy cow, this is amazingly important. Right? But believe it or not, even the powers at the top seem to follow parliamentary procedure. Anyway, carry on.
And you got to pick your battle. So you saw them in that video, just conceding because it was hopeless to further object. But if it really is important, I mean, you really need to take a stand and there's procedures for removing the chair if the chair does not do what they're supposed to. I don't know what the rules of the Senate are, or the rules of the House, or whoever was running those meetings. So maybe the ability to do that doesn't exist inside of those rules. But within Robert's Rules of Order, if a chair refuses to do their job appropriately, a majority of the assembly can remove them temporarily for the balance of the meeting. That's the power of the majority. And like I said, the parliamentarian is just advisory. It is really the chair's responsibility to know this stuff and issue rulings. And it's great to have someone who's more knowledgeable to rely upon, but it can't be someone who is just going to make things worse. That is it for the incidental motions that we're going to go through today. Is there any final questions?
Well, you didn't really cover an example of division, but we kind of just covered an example of division, so never mind.
Yeah, division.
Yeah. No, there's no other questions. That was really, again, learning. It's just learning the rules. That was good. Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it. Tell everybody about the exciting next week. All right.
So next week we are going to go through state law that govern reorganizations. Reorganizations are the meetings where state central committees and the Democratic and the state party elect officers for the subsequent 2 years. And this is something that I didn't know for a long time, but there's actually state law that governs how these things are done. Unfortunately, you can't go to the local sheriff and say, I'm sorry, but our chair is violating these statutes, because they have priority things that they're going to take care of. And it's hard to find someone to enforce these, but we are a country that is governed by the rule of law, and so you really have to do this. You have to follow the laws. So the first thing we're going to go through are the Oregon statutes that govern reorganizations. There's probably things in there that will surprise a lot of current chairs, certainly around notifications of when the events are going to be happening. And then we're going to go through Robert's Rules recommends for how to run elections. And then we're going to talk about how bylaws state the reorganizations to occur. Just an example, because every county can have a different method built within their bylaws, but that is what they have to follow. So that's going to be the next one. We're inviting all of the county chairs in the state of Oregon who are to attend this, so that they have the opportunity to be informed. It's kind of hard to expect people to do things when they haven't been offered the knowledge to do them correctly. So we're putting that out there for them, and they're more than welcome to ask questions and talk about it so they can do it right. I think I was at a meeting that had not held a reorganization meeting in years, literally. I know they've had the same chair for years, and when I was chatting with them after the meeting, I said, "So when's your next reorganization?" And they kind of looked at each other like, "I don't know. We've never had one."
Wow.
But the state law is that you have to have one within 25 months of the prior one.
Oh,
and you don't have to
for the Democratic Party, or for what in general?
All the parties.
All the parties. Okay.
All the parties that have this structure. So it's only the major parties, and it's the major parties who have opted into this precinct committee county party structure. And there's only two parties that have done that: the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Independent Party, which is a major party, has opted out, so they do not have this structure for them.
All right. Good to know. Good to know. Jeffrey Pearson, Larry, says, "Thanks, Larry, for sharing your vast knowledge." I agree. And Barbara says, "Very good info. We need a parliamentarian progressive blue wave."
Yes. And so I wanted to say a few words about the Cascadia Unit that we've talked about previously. We are organizing this within the National Association of Parliamentarians. It turns out that they put a hold on authorizing new units, so we're going to find out more about that next week when we're at the annual meeting. But someday we hope to be listed as a official group within the National Association of Parliamentarians. And the intention is to provide a way to study parliamentary procedure in Oregon outside of the Portland metro area, although anyone is welcome to join us from anywhere. Because of the internet not having boundaries, we welcome anyone. The options for membership: you can be a member of the National Association of Parliamentarians by passing a quiz. And to pass a quiz, it's really just reading one fairly easy book and understanding the concepts. You can also be a provisional member, which means that you can attend meetings and vote inside the meetings, but you're not registered with the National Association of Parliamentarians, so you're not a full member of the parent organization at that point. There is a nominal fee for joining the group, and there's a fee for being a member of the National Association of Parliamentarians, but the president of the Oregon Association has promised scholarships for anyone who needs help with that. And any current member of the National Association of Parliamentarians can administer the exams for attaining these levels. So there's the basic level of being a member of the National Association of Parliamentarians. There's becoming a registered parliamentarian, which means passing a battery of 5 tests. And then there's the highest level, which is a professional parliamentarian, which involves further study and certification to go out and charge money for this with a clean conscience. And certainly if you have an organization like a labor union or a homeowners association, which is having problems, you want to get a registered parliamentarian at the very least, and preferably a professional parliamentarian, because you're treading in legal territory. We have an exam coming up next Friday, although it's probably too late to register at this point. We'll have another exam opportunity in the Portland area coming up in September. And if you want to someone to come to you, we know who the registered parliamentarians are around the state, or the members of the National Association, and can match you up with someone to give you the exam if you're in, say, Pendleton or Jackson County or Salem, or too far to come into the Portland metro area. Just go to the website pdpo.org and sign up, and we will make you happy. The final slide is the reference material for this stuff. So the Bible of Robert's Rules is the Robert's Rules newly revised 11th edition, which is going to be valid for the next 10 days or so. It turns out that on September 8th, the 12th edition is going to be issued. There will be a transition period where people where organizations will set a specific date when they're going to transition to the new one. But if you're going to go out and buy the book at this point in time, I would wait and get the 12th edition. The material is going to be very, very similar to what exists now. The only thing I expect to have different is things like the electronic meetings requirements, where the technology has evolved and changed and enables things to happen now that wasn't conceivable 10 years ago. To pass the National Association of Parliamentarians registration exam, you should be able to do that by comprehending the middle book, which is Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised in brief, which covers 80% of the stuff you'll ever encounter in a meeting. And then if you want to become a registered parliamentarian, there's a book available that is the study guide. The study guide contains all of the questions. So for a 100 exam, for an exam with 100 questions, they will give you all 400 from which those 100 will be drawn. So if you have the endurance and stamina, you can truly learn the materials before you go into the meeting.
Nice.
That's it for today's lesson on incidental motions.
Well done. That was a lot of information, and we got it in like an hour. That was great. We're not over time. We got 4 minutes. Barbara has a great comment. Being a parliamentarian is about as powerful as being a lawyer. And it kind of is within these meetings, you know?
There's a difference between lawyers and parliamentarians. Some of the nicest people I've ever encountered has been in the parliamentarian meetings, where some of the most vicious jerks have been attorneys. So there is a distinction between the two.
I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, thank you. That's it. There's no other questions. That was great, Larry. Hang on. I'm just telling you, hang on after the song, because I do have a question about that, and I have a suggestion about that and parliamentarian stuff. So just give me a minute after that. Everybody in the audience, thank you so much for being here. Join us. What do we got coming up next, Larry? Join us Wednesday. Are we going to do a strategy show?
We need to talk.
We'll talk about doing a strategy show right after this show, everybody. Wednesday will be the next show, or it'll be Saturday. All right. But we've got some things in the works. We're doing some stuff. We just talked with Rhonda and the Washington Bernie-Crats Coalition earlier today. We're going to get a West Coast nominating thing going. We're talking about them doing that. Really cool stuff. So look for those events to come out. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us. Remember, this is all volunteer. And if you got $2, $5, $7, whatever it is, a donation really helps. Sharing the content also helps, because we get censored a lot. And this is civics. This is the stuff that we were supposed to get taught anyway. Not like all the extensive Robert's Rules, but how our democracy functions, and that Robert's Rules are a part of that. And so we're going out with a song that I've used many times before for different reasons. And usually it's about anger. Well, you know, this time though, I want it to be about, there's so much you can just put into this. It's a Bruce Cockburn cover, done by a guy named Carl Reed, and Carl Reed is dead. Carl Reed, every time I look at this story, it just gives me chills, because he recorded this song. Some guy recorded this with him at a small studio in the 90s, and it's just a really good cover of the song. Carl Reed died of some kind of brain tumor in the early 2000s. I know nothing about this guy, just the way he did the cover of the song is so powerful, and the song keeps evolving on me. The idea that we've been indoctrinated into the beliefs across the American system of what we are and who we are as a nation. Looking at all the varied comments about the death of John McCain. I'm torn on the death of John McCain, but the point of that is that we've been indoctrinated into a lot of stuff, and we've missed out on a lot of education that we should have had. And when I listen to this song, I think about my anger and my violent response to a government that doesn't function for the people, and I realize that that violent response is part of what the government has been teaching me. And I need to break that cycle. Knowing the rules, knowing how to facilitate a meeting without chaos, knowing how to engage in discussion without chaos and follow these procedures. This is all about how we change America's focus from violence to discussion and communication. And so listen to this song and think about, for me personally, how I can undo 40 years of indoctrination and work towards a democracy that's peaceful. We'll see y'all soon.
This one's called Rocket Launcher by Bruce Coburn. Learned this when I was in Australia. Off a guy called Davey Love. Here comes a helicopter. For second time today, everybody scatters, hopes it goes away. How many kids they murdered, only God can say. If I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher, I'd make somebody pay. I don't believe in bodyguards, and I don't believe in hate, and I don't believe in generals or their stinking torture states. When I talk with the survivors of things too sickening to relate, if I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher, I would not hesitate. On the Reorganizations, 100,000 wait to fall down from starvation. Some less humane fate. Cry for Guatemala with a corpse in every skate. If I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher, I would retaliate. Gonna raise every voice, well, at least I've got to try. Every time I think about it, water rises to my eyes. Well, situation's desperate, echoes of the victim's cry. If I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher, some son of a bitch would die. Some son of a bitch would die. Some son of a bitch would die.